to the presentation, but I'm wanting to follow along in August, kind of building on what we talked about last week and the power of plants. And so, of course, this one is in here. We're going to focus on those plants that I sent y'all via email earlier. And then next week, I had herbal creations in there, I think from the garden or something like that. But notice that I changed that since we already did that earlier in the year. And I can't remember what date we did that, but it's already actually on the web portal. So next Monday, we are going to make up and do the toxic plants that we missed back in July that I had to cancel at the last minute. So otherwise, we should be on track for everything else. But when I send this recording tomorrow and a few supplemental resources to you, I'll make sure that you'll note that schedule change. If you are registered for the August classes, you don't need to do anything. It's already in there. If you registered for the July class, you may get an email twice because I want to make sure I go back and capture those folks that had registered in July since we're registering month by month. So just kind of keep that in mind. If you get 2 emails from me, that's why. But with all that being said, I hope you'll hang in here with me. This, like I say, was one of the first herb presentations that we did statewide, and it really spurred a lot of interest. And that's kind of, I guess, where we're at today and kind of how we have built on some of that in the last year or so. So as always, just to kind of set the stage, again, to remind y'all, I don't have an MD or a PhD. This is just a topic that I'm very interested in. And we know that herbs and horticulture and history have long been intertwined. You hear me say that every time that I teach. And basically what we're doing today is just presenting this, again, from that historical context to just kind of align it with kind of where we are today in regards to, modern herbs that we have in our kitchen garden versus what they grew years ago. So to kind of, again, set that stage, we'll talk a little bit about what an herb actually is. And as you'll notice there, it's a plant that's going to be used for any medicinal property, flavor, or scent. And we're going to utilize those in culinary and medicinal purposes, and oftentimes spiritual ones. So I always like to put that in there because we don't want to forget that oftentimes that's how we came to know about the uses of these plants today. You often hear me say the word wort or wort. Depends on how you say that, W-O-R-T. But that is the Old English word for herb. So just kind of keep that in mind. Also, herbs are going to differ from spices because we will technically define herbs as the leafy green part of the plant, any of that vegetative structure, whereas the seeds, the berries, the bark, root, and fruit are going to be classified as spices. So just to illustrate that, we know that dill is one of our favorite herbs. It's one that's in season right now. Hopefully everybody's enjoying that corn on the cob. That's one of my favorites. But the dill seed is actually considered a spice that we use for pickling. Same thing with cilantro. That's going to be considered the herb. And then coriander is the spice. Mace and nutmeg that you see pictured here, they actually come from the same plant from the Molucca Islands, but the nutmeg is going to be the inner brown seed, and the mace is going to be the membrane. It's that red outer membrane with inside the fruit. Both are going to be considered spices. So again, this is something you hear me repeat often. I try to just make sure that we cover this in each class. But I think this is a pretty astronomical number because we've been accumulating and utilizing herbal knowledge for over 60,000 years. And we know that we have the first written account about 5,000 years ago from Sumerians in Mesopotamia, which is modern day Iraq. We've actually been able to, science has shown us that we have Neanderthals that were buried near Kandahar in northern Iraq. And we know that they were actually laid on the soil and covered with grape hyacinths, yarrow and ephedra, marshmallow pollen, and there was some other herbs. I can't remember what all they were, but we are still utilizing those in folk medicine today. And we also know that from Neanderthals back in the day, the plaque on the teeth actually suggested that they too ate yarrow and chamomile and even poplar trees. When we look a little bit deeper, and we saw a lot of this last week in the phytochemistry of herbs or plants, we know that plants give us so much. They truly are powerful. And you can kind of see there everything listed from the aromatic essences. They can be beneficial or companion plants in our garden. We will often use those in crafts or in our kitchens. We use those as a dye. And of course, we can tie everything from the historical perspective, our modern day pharmacopoeia in regards to the medicinal uses of plants, and then of course ornamental and pollinator. Now in a few weeks we are actually going to talk about an herbal. We often hear herbal used like an herbal tea or herbal essence, but it's actually an ancient manual that helped facilitate identification of plants for these medicinal purposes. And it's because of those herbals from years and years ago that we're able to put all that knowledge to use now. And you're going to actually see a lot of that come into play next week, because some of those plants last week that I mentioned in regards to alkaloids, like the belladonna plant and the poppy plant, we're really going to dive deep into some of those plants next week to really show how all of this ties together. But there again, you can see that the Chinese and the Greeks, we know that they were utilizing a lot of these plants for medicines even years before Christ. So pretty cool when we put it in that perspective. Again, just to kind of illustrate in regards to the historical elements, we know that in China, and even this is practiced today with acupuncture and diet and exercise. In India, we have Ayurveda medicine, which is the science of life. And this practice, both of these practices have come here to the U.S. in modern times, that many folks are actually utilizing this in conjunction with plants and even modern day medicine. And then you notice there in Egypt, probably one of the biggest things was basically where embalming came from, because they use those fragrant spices, much like the Neanderthal that I talked about there a few minutes ago. But also you can see the magic and prayers and spells, all of those things too were utilized in some of those ancient Egyptian times. We see the influence of herbs all throughout the world. I'm not going to go into a lot of these because this is something we'll talk about later in the year. But you can see there everything from Alexander the Great, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the spice trading routes. We're going to talk about Benedictine monasteries here in a few minutes, but the Orient, the Ottoman Empire, and of course the Hippocratic Oath. So all of these things have been influenced by plants and herbs over time. One good way to illustrate this is from our Roman garden villas. If any of you have been fortunate enough to travel to the old world, and you've seen some of these geometrically precise landscape gardens with the topiaries, the raised beds and the canals and fountains, statues, garden rooms, and potted plants. And we know that here in the New World that a lot of that carried over, and it's kind of been a rebirth of some of that. And you can kind of see how that influenced us with some of these herbs that we've been talking about all year, specific gardening styles, and especially there with raised beds and companion planting. And of course, we'll talk about the marriage of traditions with Native Americans a little bit later in the year too. I don't want to go into a lot of detail about these notable folks, but I want to make sure that you have these for reference, because these are truly the folks that help influence where we are today in regard to utilizing plants and more specifically herbs for what we use it for today, which is really cool. And again, you see Hippocrates listed there, Pliny the Elder, some of you may be familiar with him, and then Gerard. And you've probably heard me mention Gerard and Culpeper. That's something too we're going to talk about a little bit later. You see him listed here. But just to make mention here before we go any further, years ago during their time there, 1616, and that time botanists were actually referred to as herbalists during that period. So it wasn't until the 1900s that we actually started utilizing that word botanist. So again, years ago, they were known as herbalists. A few things just to kind of make mention of that you'll hear me talk about is a mordant. And what a mordant is a dye fixative or substance that's going to help set or bind dyes on fabrics. And I know Annie's on here and she does a lot of that, so I know she knows what I'm talking about there. But that's what's going to kind of help that stick to that fabric. And then Benedictine and Chartreuse, we're going to talk about that a little bit, but these were medicinal liquors actually created by those Benedictine monks. And you can see there on the bottles, you can find the letters DOM, Deo Optima Maximo, which means to God most good, most graceful. And I'll show you a picture of this here in just a minute, but Benedictine is amber in color. Its base is a cognac, but it has 27 herbs that have been infused, or the bark or the seeds that have been infused in that cognac. This is still an ancient recipe that kept it secretive, and there's only one place that actually keeps that recipe, and it was actually created by Bernardo Vincelli, I think was his name. But if you ever see Benedictine or have the opportunity to try it, some of the herbs that are going to be in there are lemon balm, arnica, hyssop, even the maidenhair fern, vanilla and artemisia, which is a wormwood, pine cone, aloe, and mace. So there's a lot of different plants. It's got a very unique flavor. It was first created in 1510, so it's been around for a really long time. And typically, when we talk about Benedictine, it's going to be enjoyed as a digestive or after an extended meal. It's sometimes even used in desserts. The monastery that actually created this first was destroyed during the French Revolution, and there for a long time it completely disappeared off the market. You can kind of see what that picture looks like. Also, in comparison, we have Chartreuse. That's a French liquor. You can get that in the yellow and green version that you see pictured here, and they do taste different, and it's just a matter of opinion which tastes better. If you have a weak stomach, then people swear by this one, the Chartreuse green. They say that they enjoy that with coffee. They call it Chartreuse jaune, which is green in French. I can't say that right. Sorry about that. But it's actually got 130 different herbs, which have just been macerated in alcohol to infuse that flavor. And they only steep it for about 8 hours, which is kind of cool. But that's actually where that color comes from, and still pretty used pretty extensively worldwide today. So as we move into herbs, and you've heard me mention these in other classes, but just kind to again, serve as a refresher, just how valuable these herbs were viewed. Basil became known as the herb of love because it was said to have grown outside of Christ's tomb after the resurrection. Interestingly enough, the Greeks did not like basil. It was the Romans who loved it and actually made it the symbol of love and fertility that we know today. And keeping within that same vein, you've heard me talk about the Virgin Mary before and how her cloak, when she threw it over the rosemary bush, which at that time the flowers were white, but once she threw that blue cloak over the plant, when she was fleeing from Egypt, it turned the rosemary flowers to the blue that we know today. So sometimes you will hear rosemary called Rose of Mary, and it's known as the herb of fidelity. And oftentimes it will be burned as an incense at weddings. And then thyme was actually thought to be the herb or the plant that was the straw bed of Jesus in the manger bed. You've heard me talk about Socrates before, and we'll talk a little bit more about him next week, and I'll give you the full story. But he was sentenced to death, so they made him drink the juice of the poison hemlock. And we know this because his student Plato actually documented that death. And Bethany, which I've blown this up so you could see that a little bit better, but as I've mentioned before, if you walk through old cemeteries, maybe even abandoned cemeteries in some of our national parks over here in Cates Cove or Cataloochee, you'll often find this plant, which is known as Bethany, to keep the witchcraft at bay. And that's a tradition brought to us from the Anglo-Saxons, especially during the colonial period. Witch hazel has a lot of that same story as well. Hamamelis virginiana, which is our native witch hazel, was what they would use for the dowsing rods to find water. Now, I'll confess, in college we would do that over. We would go out to the farm over the graves, any of the hogs that died, and would do that to our freshman class just to wig them out a little bit. So it will do that if you want to try that. But you can see there from that picture, dowsing for water. And we still have a huge group of dowsers even today in the Raleigh, North Carolina area. One of my favorites was the small bouquets, like you see pictured here, which were called Tussie Mussies. And we actually would use these to exchange, and basically it's a modern day greeting card. Was what these Tussie Mussies were in the 1400s. So different plants were associated with different types of symbolism. So depending on the bouquet you got was the message that you were being sent. So this was huge, of course, during the Victorian era, and it was known as that secret language of flowers. So it's kind of cool to think about how that really evolved today. We send red roses at Valentine's Day, and not to take away from that, but really think about that at Valentine's Day, because it kind of all started in the Victorian age with just these little Tussie Mussies. So I put a list in the Google Drive for you, but Angelica, which we're going to talk about tonight, actually represented inspiration. We mentioned basil representing love a few minutes ago. We're going to talk about calendula, which symbolized health. And you've heard me talk about calendula many times, and it's one of my favorites in that regard. Echinacea ironically meant being capability. Even hops were mentioned. They represented mirth. Lavender represented devotion. Lady's mantle, which we kind of have on the cusp of being a good plant versus bad plant. We'll talk more about that later. But it actually gave you comfort. And then mint virtue. That's a tongue twister. Parsley represented gratitude. So we had a lot of different Tussie Mussies that flower bouquets could represent. Now, of course, we know these commonplace herbs. I don't want to take away from these. And we're going to talk about kitchen gardens sometime before 2021 is over, and we'll focus a little bit more on those and some of their uses that maybe extend beyond the normal realm within our kitchen. But for today, we're going to kind of skip what I call the ordinary and move to extraordinary. And what I mean from that is looking at how, again, you've heard me talk about Appalachian culture and how we kind of it's just the immersion of cultures and traditions everywhere, all this influence from all around the world, kind of how it settled into this area. So we know that the heyday of herbal healing, it did yield some of these modern scientific advances. And again, that's what we're going to talk about next week. But think about when the Pilgrims first arrived at Plymouth Rock. At that time, there was fewer than 90 diseases that were actually known among the Native Americans. The colonists took note of this, and they, when those relationships started forming with the natives, they really looked to the Native Americans for healing and for guidance. And that's kind of how a lot of this came into play. And of course, the Native Americans were very spiritual as well. They viewed the plants to have some kind of symbolic and spiritual manifestation, as well as being used for medicinal purposes. So not all, but most of the remedies that we find in Western herbalist dispensary today were introduced to the settlers by the Indians. So black cohosh, echinacea, golden seal, all of those, ginseng, to just name a few. So we're going to jump in and talk about some of these just at length. I'm hoping some of these might be new to a few of you. But Angelica, arcane, and Angelica, see, that's a mouthful, y'all. The Latin really gets confusing sometimes. But the reason it's called Angelica is because it is connected with the Archangel Gabriel. And he was the one that appeared to the Virgin Mary at Annunciation. It's also associated with the Archangel Michael. And Michael's feast day is in May. So this is one that we're going to see. It is a perennial. It'll start emerging through here in Northeast Tennessee. It's one of the first to come up in my garden, which is really nice. If you like rhubarb, then you'll really like Angelica. It's going to have that same type fragrance. It's going to taste a little bit more like licorice, though, than, of course, rhubarb. If you've ever traveled to Iceland, then you've probably had this because it's considered a delicacy there, because they eat the stems and roots raw with butter. So it's almost cooked or eaten like asparagus. They'll sometimes mildly steam it, but it's also just eaten raw. The root is going to be used as a flavoring agent in vermouth and in gin. So if you like either one of those liqueurs, then you are enjoying Angelica. Again, Angelica is going to be used in that Benedictine and chartreuse as well. We also will candy the stems, which looks a lot like celery. I don't know if you can see that in that picture very good. A lot of folks will interchange anise or anise, depending on where you're from, how you say that. But a lot of folks will interchange those two. And then it has also been used as a flavoring in cigarettes, and that came from the Native Americans as well. The Arkansas, and I can't remember specifically which group it was, but they used the root to mix with tobacco to give it a little bit better flavor. This is what the umbel looks like, or the flower looks like. It's been said if you need to feel angelic, need to feel a little bit better, then take you a bath with Angelica to help calm the nerves. Oftentimes the essential oil will be used in perfumes and creams, soaps and ointments, and it's often used as an incense to freshen rooms. And then it's also used in herbal pillows, the seeds are, and you can see how prolific those seed heads are. But again, this is one that we don't always think about when we talk about essential oils or bath pillows or anything. And it's, to some people, a very ugly ornamental plant. I guess it's just a matter of preference, but it can be rather tall. So it can be used to kind of frame in a landscape. It is going to, again, get very tall. So be aware of that, because it can kind of overtake, and it will spread every year as well. A lot of folks say they have better luck growing this plant from seed. But if you do plant the seed, you don't want to cover that seed, because they're going to need a lot of light to germinate. You're going to want to do that in the spring. It's going to behave a lot like the Queen Anne's lace or any of those wild carrot, the wild parsley, any of that, because it's going to be known as a perennial biennial, which can be a little bit confusing, but that just means it's going to die back after it flowers, and it's going to produce that crop of seed, and then it'll produce again the next year. So oftentimes, though, the bad thing is going to be confused with poison hemlock, but the big difference, you can kind of see how these umbels spread out at the top rather than being a little bit flat like the poison hemlock. If you utilize dye, Angelica is a great one to produce the dark green, which you will use in wool. And oftentimes you'll have to use iron as a mordant for that. But you can kind of see what that umbel flower looks like there. If you've ever heard of the herb Dong Quai, that is a species of Angelica. It's not our Angelica here. That is the one that's actually indigenous to China, but they're very similar. So if you ever see that, then you know it's going to have a lot of the same properties. We spent a lot of time talking about bee balm in the past, but this is going to be our native species, which is going to be a member of the mint family. Not quite as invasive as a lot of our peppermints and spearmints and things like that. But again, our native species, many different colors. It's going to be a great pollinator plant. But this was actually discovered by the Indians in New York, and it was named Otsego, or which later became known as Oswego. And then you've heard me mention a couple of weeks ago that this is actually what they drank in place of tea during the Boston Tea Party. The Indians and settlers both drank this as that tea replacement. It was cultivated in Europe because John Bartram, and we've talked about him a few times, gathering seeds and plants from this area and taking them to cultivate over there. But he took the seeds, and today over in Europe, it's known as Indian nettle and sometimes golden melissa, which we know melissa is lemon balm in the UK. So they have the same issue we do here in the US. Different plant, or the same plant's going to go by many different names. Bee balm is going to be one that is going to act different depending on where it's grown. It can be an annual depending on how far north you are. It can be a biennial or a perennial. One thing to make mention of is if you do interplant different species, you want to kind of keep that thinned out, because it can reduce your flower production and you won't have these big flowers like you see here. Depending on where you are in regards to Appalachia, sometimes you'll hear this called horse mint, but we will typically refer to the Pacanthamum species of mint as the horse mint in southern Appalachia. But that's why, again, understanding this Latin right here, the Monarda didyma, is so important to make sure we know which species we're talking about. But if you're just getting started with an herb garden, this is going to be one of the easiest ones to grow. It can be propagated by seeds. It does cross-pollinate though, so you can get an uneven flower stand because of that as well. But it's going to spread really, really fast. So if you have an area wanting to fill in, this one does really, really great. Keep it pruned down through the summer because it's just going to continually produce. Now this is going to be the Pacanthamum species I was talking about. Ignore that bee balm up there. I meant to take that off. Whoops. Sorry about that. But just keep that in mind that we also call bee balm bergamot, and that's because of the scent of orange leaves or the bergamot oranges of Seville. This is also going to be used in a lot of perfumes, bath and body, lotions and potions and that kind of stuff too. Now, lemon bee balm is different from lemon balm, so keep that in mind as well. And I put a chart to kind of deviate all of these Monarda species from like our mountain mint species. So hopefully that'll kind of clarify some of that. Again, a lot of that's going to be just a cultural thing, depending on where you grew up as to what you call, which plant. Bee balm can be a little bit confusing. Borage, this is one you've probably heard me mention several times. It's one of my favorite annual plants to grow in the garden because all parts of this plant are edible. It tastes like cucumber. But when we look historically at this plant, it actually invokes courage. That's what its lore is known to do. It was a favorite among the soldiers during the Celtic Wars. They had a saying that actually translated to mean borage always brings me courage. So there was a little deviation in that, meaning borage always brings me delight. But either way that you look at it, it has a very storied past. During the Crusades, it was used in infusions before they left for the Holy Land. So the ladies would actually embroider the flowers, and I'll show you a better picture of what these flowers look like because they're star-shaped, but they would embroider that on their scarves, and then they would give that to their knights to carry with them to the Holy Land before they left for the war. And you can kind of see how dainty, how pretty that little flower is. And there are blue and white colors. And again, both of those are going to be 100% edible. According to an old wives' tale, borage was sometimes smuggled into the drink of prospective husbands just to give them courage to propose marriage. So if any of you are single ladies, you might want to slip a little borage into his glass when he's not looking. It does, like I say, have a really crisp cucumber flavor. It's going to reseed itself very prolifically, so you're not going to have to invest a lot of money. You can buy one plant or one pack of seeds, and this is what you're going to end up with. You can also use those flowers in baked goods, or really cool in the summertime to freeze those in ice cubes and use them for cocktails. We're going to talk about salad burnet here in a few minutes. As far as the flavor, it's going to be very similar. The only difference there is that borage is not going to store as long unless you infuse it in vinegar. It does make for a really pretty ornamental plant as well. It does sprawl out though, and it can be kind of ugly. So some people will want to keep that pruned back in the summer months. If you grow strawberries, this is an excellent plant to grow with your strawberries. It's been said to actually make your strawberries taste a little bit sweeter. And of course, we're drawing those pollinators in. It will grow from seed after the danger of frost. And if you only have access to a container garden, it's one that's going to grow really well in containers. You just want to keep it kind of tidied up. And you can kind of see there what the whole plant looks like. When we talked about moon gardens a few months ago, I didn't mention this one, but I don't know if you can tell from that silvery foliage. And then especially if you have the white flowered borage, it's a really nice addition to your moon garden. Just to spend a little time on calendula, because I just can't stress this plant enough. It's a great one to add to your landscape or to your garden. This one here is actually Calendula officinalis, but the Calendula resina, when we talked about herbs last month, was the one I told you had more medicinal properties, but they are going to look very, very similar. And oftentimes when we talk about these two cultivars, I kind of use those interchangeably, but just to specify if you're wanting to use the calendula for salves and lotions and things like that. The calendula resina is the one you want to make sure that you purchase. But when we do talk about calendula, we'll often refer to it as pot marigold, but just make sure you know that that's not related to the Tagetes marigolds that we often see growing in the garden that have the really nice smell, which are a great companion plant, by the way. But this plant here is actually native to the Canary Islands there in northern Africa and in Iran. And again, it's known as the pot marigold. The Christians were the ones that named this because it bloomed during the time of festivals at that time that celebrated the Virgin Mary. The name that was given by the Romans, they observed that the flowers were in bloom on the first day of Calends, which is the first day of every month. So they knew that pretty much 7 to 8 months out of the year, it was blooming on that first day of that month. The Romans would also use this to treat scorpion bites. And of course, we know we've kind of carried that over because it is such a healer today. But many also thought that this plant possessed magic. If a woman couldn't choose between suitors, then she would mix up calendula in combination with honey and other herbs and just drink that concoction. And then she would see her husband in her dreams that night. So it often extends itself beyond the medicinal properties. And this is where we get into some of that spiritual ritual. It is considered to be a vegetable in England, and they will grow this with spinach. So if you've ever been to the United Kingdom, then you'll often see this plant intermingled in the garden, and they will actually eat it just like they do spinach. The Scandinavians will actually eat the flowers in the oatmeal and puddings and dumplings, and they actually add it to wine as well. It was brought to the New World from the colonists, and then it was after the Civil War that it kind of lost its luster, but it's made a bounce back. You can see there it does make a great addition to your landscape. It's grown very easily from seed. The big thing about the seed, though, it's not one of those that you want to have a seed packet from a couple of years ago because it probably won't germinate. It's kind of finicky in that regard, but fresh seed, it'll take off, and you can kind of see how that filled in right there. If it snows, we even get an early frost. Oftentimes, calendula will make it through that, and sometimes you'll even see this blooming on up into Thanksgiving, maybe even Christmas, depending on the weather. If you harvest the petals, be gentle. Don't let the petals touch one another because that's going to fade their color if you're using only the flower petals. If you need a highlights, a cure for your highlights, you can kind of see what mine's doing here. Use a calendula rinse because that's going to help highlight your highlights. And you'll often see that in the shampoo aisle, ladies, a calendula rinse, or you'll see some kind of herbal botanic shampoo that boasts having calendula, and that's why it will brighten the highlights. And then if we go back to India, these petals were actually used to decorate the altars of the Hindu temples, and that's still used today. This will produce a very lovely yellow dye. You just need a little alum to make it work well. And you can mix calendula flowers, sesame seeds, a little mayo, cheese, and liverwurst, and makes a really great sandwich if you're into liverwurst. And another thing, it was known as the poor man's saffron. So you know how expensive that saffron is, which actually comes from the crocus plant, Crocus sativus to be more specific. But it's going to have a lot of the similar flavors. It's just going to be a lot less expensive. So it takes about 1,000 flowers to produce about an ounce of real saffron. So that's why calendula is so much cheaper to grow. If you've never cooked with it like that, you should try it. It's actually pretty good. Next on our list is chervil. This is a plant that is native to Russia. Sometimes you will hear this plant called sweet Sicily, but that's not really an accurate description because the real sweet Sicily is actually myrrh. But again, kind of depending on where you were raised, you may hear those names used interchangeably. So parsley is going to be related to this plant. You can probably tell that by looking at it. You've probably never tried myrrh, but the fragrance and the flavor are going to resemble that. And remember, myrrh was what the wise men brought to baby Jesus. So when we talk about chervil, it does have a more pronounced flavor than parsley. It's going to be a little bit more on the licorice side, a little bit more like anise. One of the ancient traditions was to serve chervil soup on Holy Thursday. And that's a tongue twister too. It's considered a warm herb, and we'll talk a little bit about warming and cooling herbs later in the year, but it's considered warm because it just fills those senses very slowly and with what herbalists will call with subtlety. And we didn't speak a lot about Pliny the Elder, but he was an early Roman scholar. And then, of course, Culpeper, but they agreed that this was one of the best herbs that you could eat and utilize on a really cold winter's day. It's really easy to grow. It actually grows a little bit better from seed, but it's going to take it a while to germinate. So you'll swear it's not coming up. It can take up to 2 weeks to actually germinate. You don't want it to bolt like you see starting to do here, because of course you're going to lose a lot of that essential oil. Any plant, when we allow it to flower, we're going to lose some of that boldness of that essential oil. It kind of, to me, looks a little bit like cilantro, but the taste is nowhere similar. If you have a shady area, this one prefers to be grown in the shade versus sunlight. Again, if you don't have a lot of space, it's going to grow really well in a pot. It is considered an annual, though, by the way. The other good thing about chervil is that the entire plant is going to be edible. You can probably tell there it's going to be used really nice as a garnish. The Romans actually still consider this one of their essential kitchen herbs. So if you've ever had a French cookbook, and I'm not going to slaughter the name, y'all, it's in the notes, but they will actually blanch sprigs of chervil and use that in cooking. If you've ever used Finnis herbs from France, that's going to be one of the main herbs in the Finnis herbs. So chervil, parsley, thyme, and tarragon are going to be the 4 herbs used in that mix. If you use chervil to cook with, because it is a little bit more potent than parsley, you want to add it at the very end of cooking, any kind of soup, stew, or sauce, because otherwise it's going to be really bold. If you like eggs and spinach and carrots, it's a really good addition to that. If you like béarnaise sauce, add it toward the end of the béarnaise sauce for a little spicy, warming enhancement. And you can also compound this in butter, and it's really good just on crackers or bread. And history tells us it's also one of those plants, if we talk about the tussie mussies, it was considered a cheerful herb. So if you wanted to spread cheer and happiness, then you would give a bouquet of chervil. And even today, it's going to be used oftentimes in potpourri and dried bouquets. And if you're really bad to get the hiccups, and I don't know if you're like me, but if you get them one time, it's like within 24 hours, you're just constantly dealing with the hiccups. Munch on some chervil. It's said to be an old folklore remedy for hiccups. Next up, we're going to talk about comfrey. And we know that this has been acclaimed as the great healer. And sometimes you will hear this plant called knit bones, K-N-I-T. For that very reason. It's been around since 400 BC. The Greeks used this plant to stop bleeding, and they would treat any kind of respiratory or bronchial type problems. It's derived from the Latin name conferta, which means to grow together. Another reason that it's called knit bones, or it means coming together. Pliny the Elder noticed that when you cook the roots, they would stick together and lump together like glue. And so that's why ancient healers would use this to mend broken bones or to heal cuts. And you've heard me mention that before in salves. If you add this to calendula and plantain, it does really well. You just want to make sure that you clean that area, because once it seals that wound, it's going to lock in anything that's in there behind that skin. So you have to be careful with that. It's considered by many in the world to be a really fast protein blood builder. It's a rare source of vitamin B12, so vegetarians will often take advantage of this plant just for that reason. And then it also tells us, or the plant is also one of the first to emerge in the springtime. Actually, let me show you a picture there. You can see what those flowers look like. Excellent pollinator plant. It comes up, it's going to bloom all throughout the season. It's very fast growing, but it spreads. It's very, very vigorous. So you hear me fuss about mint, how you have to contain it. I really think this is even more aggressive than mint. But if you're utilizing the plant and keeping it cut back all throughout the season, it's not going to hurt this plant's feelings. You can, like right now, it's August 9th. I can go outside right now and cut this plant all the way down, almost to the ground. And within a couple of weeks, it's going to bounce back and look just like this. But one of the reasons I like this plant, besides utilizing it and some of those salves and it being a great protein builder, is because right now or all summer long, as you're pruning this back, throw it in your row middles in your garden, add it onto your compost pile, because it's really going to help speed up that process and it's going to break down things faster. Plus, I don't know if I've got a picture of that in here or not, but the root system is massive. It's absolutely huge, and it's got a tremendous taproot. So it's one of those plants we call a minor plant. So it's going to go way down deep in the soil, and it's going to pull up a lot of those secondary nutrients that we don't always think about. And it's going to make those more available for any plants that you grow in that area. So that's one reason I like to throw it in the row middles on my garden. And then I rotate those row middles each year. So I'm getting added nutrition from that benefit. If you have these plants, you can share with friends just by dividing the roots in the fall. You can also save the seeds, and you can take cuttings from this plant anytime. But again, once you get it established, it's really hard to get rid of it. So make sure you put it where you know you want it to be. You can make a compost tea with the leaves and stems as well. Just mix it all in a big bucket and add it to your garden. And you can see here what that root system looks like. It's massive. And if you pull up a full-size plant, I mean, it's almost hard to do, but that does make mention or bears mentioning that you don't want to plant it near water, or not water, but septics or anything like that, because you can see how much damage those roots could in fact do. Next up is elecampane. It's Inula helenium. Trying to get better at speaking my Latin. But oftentimes you'll hear this one called wild sunflower. And it is native which this is weird, y'all. It's native to Nova Scotia and it's native to North Carolina, to be specific. It's a very bitter, very pungent plant. So we know when we say it's a bitter plant, we know that it's going to help stimulate that digestive system. And that's what the Romans used it for. That's what they discovered its use for, was treating indigestion. The Latin inula, that's a derivative of the Greek word Hellenian, which goes back to Helen of Troy, because she ate a handful of this plant when Paris stole her away. Another plant or another legend is that the plant sprung from the goddess Helena, or Helena, however you want to say that, from her tears. And then it was also rumored to be named for the island of Helena, where the best plants in the world are rumored to have grown. When we talk about Pliny the Elder, this is one. If you click on some of those links that I gave you earlier, he talks about this plant all the time because it just kept hanging around through all these battles and all these wars and conflicts during the Middle Ages. It earned a lot of different names because it just kept surviving. Sometimes it's called elfwort, ELF, which is one of my favorite names for this plant. I don't know why. I just like the word or the name elfwort. Horseheal and scabwort are two other names that it's known for, because veterinarians back in that day said that it would help heal sheep scab and any kind of horse ailment. You can see there how prolific the foliage is. It looks very similar to the comfrey, but it's really a pretty ornamental. It's really nice interplanted with daisies and geraniums. Even though this plant's much taller, it kind of frames in those. And many folks, if you're doing a smart yard or doing a rain garden, folks will use this to create that natural habitat area. And you can see there what that root system looks like. And it's a pretty, like I say, it's really pretty with red geraniums. The Indians use this for all kinds of different things as well. The rootstock is used in candy making, and it's almost like the marshmallow, but you can see there how prolific it can grow to be. This is Feverfew, which is a dainty, pretty little flower. It is a member of the daisy family. It's native to Europe. This is going to be one of the plants that they brought over from the old world. Oftentimes, it's going to be confused with chamomile. It does look a lot like that, but feverfew actually got its name because the Latin means driver out of fevers. So the ancient Romans believed that it had power, but by medieval times, all that lore had kind of vanished. But this was a plant that they used extensively in childbirth. It helped reduce those fevers. And the British, they still hold this plant pretty high esteem for arthritis and migraines. You'll often see that sold on supermarket shelves there. It's going to grow anywhere that there's a little bit of sunlight they can get to. It's going to grow in a crack and crevice. This is one that's really hard to get started by seeds. So if you do have a seed pack, just beware that you might not be very successful. And if you do start seeds, make sure it gets 100% full sun. It's going to need a lot of light to germinate. It's also been said, and I've got different research on this, but some beekeepers swear that bees don't like the smell of feverfew. But then some research shows that it's actually a pollinator and draws them in. So I put both of those links in the document. Both of those are pretty interesting, and they're both highly acclaimed. So if you're a beekeeper, you might want to read that. This is actually going to be used as a plant in rock gardens, and we know that the dried stems make beautiful arrangements like you see here. And oftentimes it's going to be used as an insect repellent too. It's going to repel moths more specifically. Now, Horrorhound, we know that this too is a very bitter herb. It's a very aromatic herb. If you have grown this plant, then you know what I'm talking about. It's got a very woodsy fragrance. You either like it or you don't. The name comes from Horus, which was the Egyptian god of sky and light. And when we talk about the Greeks and the Hebrews, they really kind of worshiped this plant because they thought that Horrorhound could actually break magic spells. But it's also said to relieve a number of ailments, especially sore throat. So Horrorhound candy, you know, that you can grab up at the Cracker Barrel. It's not just a tasty sweet treat, but it also has a medicinal use as well. So we know Horrorhound cough drops actually made their appearance in the 1600s in England, and then they came over to the United States, and it was the Shakers that made Horrorhound lozenges popular. It's got a pretty little dainty flower. If you mix it with fennel, it's really tasty. A lot of folks will add it to lemonade or iced tea. Also, there's an old-timey recipe to make a cough syrup with it. You just infuse it with honey. And again, it's one of the biggest confections in candy making today. And oftentimes it's going to be combined with hyssop and even rue and rose and marshmallow to make a really good candy. It is going to have a menthol-like taste in the leaves. So keep that in mind if you don't like that. Because in Britain, they actually sell this as an ale. It's called a Horrorhound ale, and it kind of like opens up your sinuses. It's pretty stout. It's used as a hops substitute. This was a ritual bitter herb of Passover. It was the meal that represented the flight of Jews from Egypt. You heard me mention that, I guess it was last week. So they would serve this alongside romaine lettuce or grated horseradish. And it's, again, used to symbolize the slavery in Egypt. You can kind of see there, it kind of grows everywhere. This is in a cinder block. You do kind of have to contain it. But you'll also notice there from the silvery foliage, it's a great moonlight plant. It's a great pollinator plant. You just have to be restrictive with it. And the other thing is that it gets really rubbery. So if you let it go this time of year, it's starting to fall over and it kind of looks ugly. But you can go ahead and cut that back, and it's just going to sprout up and continue growing. It's really not going to matter when you prune it throughout the season. If you're drying this plant, just be aware that the flavor is going to fade really, really fast. So if you're drying it, make sure that you go ahead and utilize it, mince it up, cut it up, however you're going to do it, and store it in the jar and try to use that pretty quickly. Hissa, this is one of the plants that we used as a strewing herb years ago, and we had dirt floors. It would kind of alleviate some of the odor, but it is considered one of the holy herbs, especially from the Greeks and the Hebrews. It has a very strong camphor-like odor, so again, it's going to smell like a medicine cabinet, but it's rumored to be the hyssop that was used in the Bible to cure leprosy. Some researchers think so, some don't, but I put the link in there so you can read up on that on your own time. They would also not only use this in their houses, but think about any kind of nursing ward, any kind of medicine facility back in that time, again, just because it would help alleviate some of the odor. So as far as cooking, it's really good to add to tomato sauce if you've never tried that, or on cheese omelets, and imparts a really nice taste. Hippocrates considered this to be one of the greatest plants ever. It was used in Benedictine and chartreuse both because it had such healing properties. It was pretty much used in everything as far in the kitchen as far as cooking. It was also rumored to cure a black eye. You could just create a poultice and put it on the black eye. Also used in potpourri and in perfumes. Very easy to grow, like you see here. It can spread pretty prolifically and kind of get outside of its barrier. So if you don't want it to take over the universe, again, you have to be kind of restrictive with it. The Elizabethans used this in their gardens, but they would keep it clipped all season long. Just like you've heard me mention several times tonight, you can do that all throughout the season, and they'll continue to give many flushes of growth. So don't be worried about doing that. You can see here why it's such a great pollinator. This is another one that you can compound with butter, and it tastes very good. This is lovage, and if you look at the foliage, you probably notice that it looks very similar to the first plant we talked about, Angelica, and it's actually going to have a lot of the same flavor and similarities. But this is going to be a perennial that's native to Europe, but it has been naturalized here in the U.S. If you love celery, then I would recommend cooking with this. It's just a delightful substitute for celery, and it's so easy to grow. So you're not having to run to the grocery store all the time. You can just go out back and fetch this from your kitchen garden. The only bad thing about this is that it's much larger than celery. It's going to get really tall, just like the Angelica, but it's very, very tasty, and you can just cut it back. It tends to get a really hollow stalk. So if you're not staking it up in your garden, oftentimes it's going to flop over anyway. And when it does that, a lot of people don't like it, being ugly in a landscape like that. But if it does that, just chop it down, and oftentimes it's going to resprout from that root system anyway. The Middle Ages is kind of what made this plant so popular, because they said that it was a psychic plant. So Charlemagne had this growing all over his landscape. And this is one that they still utilize pretty frequently as a folk remedy to alleviate stomach aches and any kind of kidney issues. And again, all parts of this plant are going to be used as a substitute for celery. And if salt's an issue, lovage and savory, which I think we're going to talk about savory, are both really good herbs to use as salt substitute. This plant will pretty well grow anywhere, but it is going to prefer sun because it gets really leggy. It's already a leggy plant. It's going to get even leggier in the shade. This is one that's going to disappear in the fall. It's going to die back every year, but it comes back bigger and stronger every year. So keep that in mind when you plant this. You can get a start from a friend. It divides really easy. If you want a bushier plant, just keep that foliage pruned back. And actually, if you keep it pruned back, you're going to, that essential oil is going to be stronger, and you're going to have a much more prevalent celery taste as well. You can also freeze this plant, just blanch the leaves before you freeze. And if you have headaches, it's good for that. But probably one of my favorite stories as far as folklore is that it was known as love ache. Instead of lovage, it was known as love ache because it was used as an aphrodisiac in love potions and charms. So not only was it a psychic plant, people would grow this to be able to see into the future, but also an aphrodisiac. So medieval travelers, they would place lovage in their boots because it would help eradicate odor. And it was also used as a deodorant in the Middle Ages. And then if you needed to stay awake for whatever reason, if you're driving over a long period of time or something, just chew on a piece of the dried root and it'll keep you awake for days. But you can see there what that foliage looks like. If you like potatoes, they make a great accompaniment to potatoes, both in the skillet and in the garden. And as far as a compounded butter, this is probably one of my favorites. So I would highly recommend trying that. Next up, we have rue. And this is another one that has a pretty storied past. Ruta, the Latin here, actually comes from the Greek ruo, which means to set free. And Aristotle loved this herb because he said it cured his indigestion. It was deemed an anti-magical herb, and Pliny believed that it helped cure any kind of bad vision. I'm not sure what that would have been like back in that day, now that we have contacts and glasses and LASIK eye surgery, but this was considered the vision enhancer back in the day. If you've ever grown rue, you know it's got a very distinctive fragrance, but it also has a very volatile oil, which is going to enhance that essential oil, hence the aroma that we smell. But it's very volatile, and some people are going to be allergic to it. It's not going to be like a poison ivy, but some people will develop a really bad rash working around rue. So if you had this plant, you've been working outside, and you get these splotches or hives, you probably blame that on the oil in the rue. It does have a pretty silvery foliage, really tiny leaves. A lot of people like that delicate foliage, and then the really unique little yellow flowers. So the reason that rue is regarded as such an esteemed herb, because it was during the Great Plague of London, which was in the 1650s, I think. There was about 7,000 people that were dying each week with the plague. And herbs were used to kind of help cure the infected, as well as to ward off the disease. So nobody really knew what was causing the disease or how to avoid it, but they knew that this plant would help alleviate a lot of that issue, because they would take a red cross and paint it on the doors of the homes where the plague or a death had occurred because of the plague. And that would provide a signal for anyone. So the story goes that during the 15th century, the bubonic plague was running rampant. So a group of thieves, y'all know where I'm going with this, don't you? A group of thieves created this blend of herbal oils that had healing powers, and they said that it could ward off the plague. So when the thieves were apprehended, they traded their secret blend of herbs, which we know as 4 thieves, 5 thieves, 3 thieves. There's lots of different recipes. But years ago, rue was the primary ingredient, and that's where the name for the 3 thieves actually came from. So if you're interested in the old version of the true thieves oil, then I've included that in the Google Drive for you. The other cool thing about rue is that it was an antidote to poisons, specifically spider bites, snake bites, scorpion bites. So oftentimes you would see this plant hung around the neck of an individual that suffered from seizures, because they thought it would both cure, but it also sent that warning. It also, I don't know if you can tell from this picture, but think about playing cards. It was used as an early model for the suit of clubs, which is kind of cool. It's not often grown as an ornamental, but it does kind of tell a story. So if you do grow it, just kind of keep that in mind. And again, it makes a really nice addition to a moonlight garden. And there's some links in there that gives you more details about the thieves oil, as well as the recipe. Salad burnet, it does look very similar to chervil, so you can kind of see how they're related, but this plant's actually in the rose family. So when we think about the cucumber to your salad, this was it. This was the plant 400 years ago. If you go to any fine upscale dining, some of those gastropubs today, then you'll see this being served. It was also used as an accompaniment to wine. So think about Bloody Marys back in the day, or even Bloody Marys today. In some of these trendy bars, you're going to get chervil instead of the celery. It was used, though, as medicine. Again, this is one of Pliny the Elder's favorites, and he raved about the medicinal properties. It does have a really pretty flower. I'm going to show you that here in a few minutes, because it, too, was regarded to be one of the plants that helped stave off the plague as well. If you would dissolve the flowers, it would, in white wine, then it would, and drink it, of course, it would give you protection from the plague. But this is one that came to us with the colonists as well. And you can kind of see there what that bloom looks like. If you do eat this in salads, only eat the tender young leaves, because the older leaves that are going to be higher up on the plant are really, really bitter. So if you've had dandelion before, you know how bitter that plant is. Multiply that by like 10, because it's very bitter. So always go for the young new leaves. A lot of folks will use this in a compound butter or in vinegars, even as a garnish, because it does have that pretty bloom, or in beverages. The seeds from this are going to be utilized often in marinades and vinegars and even cheese spreads. And if you look at some of those fancy cheeses in the deli section, then you'll see this listed. It does lose flavor really quickly. So keep that in mind. If you let it flower, those seeds you can just toss into your coleslaw for a nice celery flavor, but a really pretty low growing plant. It's also considered nature's deodorizer. So it reseeds pretty prolifically. And I'm going to wind us up here in just a few minutes. I'm just rambling on and on, y'all. Sorry about that. Savory, there's summer savory and there's winter savory. So summer savory is going to be the annual. Winter savory is going to be the perennial. They do grow a little bit differently. This one here is the summer savory. So this was the strongest cooking herb that was available to Europeans until world exploration and those trade routes opened up and brought them black pepper. So this is actually what they utilized all those years. This is a really old plant. It's been around for over 2,000 years. Many stories about it. I put a lot of links in here, but again, one of Pliny the Elder's favorite plants. Virgil mentioned this in his writings as well. During Caesar's reign, the Romans introduced it to England, and that's where it became really popular and made its way to the New World here. It's very, very pungent. And then Native Americans, interestingly, thought that it would heal deafness. It is native to the Mediterranean region. It's really easy to grow. When you do harvest it and you're going to store it for drying, this is one that I do every year. After about 18 months, it loses its flavor. So just kind of keep that in mind. It's not one you want to grow a lot of, because you're not going to use that much. It's going to provide a lot of flavor. A little dab will do you. A lot of people will season seafood with this, as well as mozzarella, any kind of cheese it's really good with. Italians actually love this. They cook it with green beans. This is the other salt substitute I was talking about. So if that's an issue, it's really good, especially, like I say, in green beans. Sweet woodruff, and I'm rushing along here because I'm a little over an hour, but you've probably heard me mention sweet woodruff before. A lot of these plants that I put in tonight I think are often overlooked, and that's one reason I wanted to mention them. And especially this one, I call this nature's carpet. It's a very low maintenance plant, very delicate, as you can see there. And what I love most about it is that the smell is like fresh cut hay and vanilla. So if you like the smell of fresh cut hay, then you would love this plant. You're just going to get a little bit more of a whiff of vanilla, which is really nice. Elizabethans would use this for sachets. They would tie it in their clothing. They would make garlands out of it because it did smell so good. And then sweet woodruff in Germany was used to sweeten May wine. So this is one that the Druids absolutely loved for that purpose. It does represent humility. Think back to the Tussie Mussies we talked about a few minutes ago. And the reason that it represents that is because it grows so low to the ground. It also is going to lend a very subtle, grassy vanilla bouquet to wine. So not only was it used in that May wine, but any wine that you drink today, if you add a sprig or two to it, to a bottle for a day or so, it's going to enhance the flavor or the bouquet of that wine. So think about a Sauvignon Blanc. If you've ever drank a Sauvignon Blanc, you know that it's got those grassy undertones anyway, and it's just going to impart a little bit more of a vanilla, kind of balance that out a little bit better. A lot of people will eat this plant with strawberries. And you can kind of see there the reason it's called nature's carpet and the reason it represents humility. Because it does have such a sweet smell, oftentimes it's going to be used to scent linens, and thus it's going to serve a dual purpose and repel insects. But it is considered one of those classical woodland residents. If you mordant this with alum, it's going to give you a tan dye. So it's a really bright tan. But really lovely if you have a shade garden. You can see there it intermingles nice with rocks or with any kind of ferns or hostas. The foliage, a lot of folks will get this confused with bedstraw or the madder and cleavers. All of those were used during medieval times, but there's no relation to that. And this is not going to be quite as sticky as the cleavers and everything. But even still today, sweet woodruff is used as a flavoring agent in tobacco. And we're going to wind it up here. 2 more plants, y'all. If you need to drop off, I totally understand. We'll get this recorded and sent out to you. But tansy is one that can be very invasive. But the reason I like tansy is because it repels ants. That's the biggest reason I like this. But it does mean immortality when we look at the history of the plant, and that's because the flower stays in bloom pretty much all season long, and that's the reason it represents immortality. Very easy to grow, but this is one you only need one, because once it gets started, it will take over the world, and it gets really tall, so keep that in mind. But it is a medicinal plant as well, used as a spring tonic. So you've heard me talk about dandelions and ramps and all that good stuff that comes on early in the spring. This is going to be one that we're going to see early, along with the comfrey. It's going to start emerging pretty early. So that's one reason it was used as that tonic. It's going to be great in any type of pastry as well. You just want to use it sparingly. And then Flujon, you've heard me talk about that. We talked a little bit about that last week. It does have some toxic properties. So that's why it's used as an insect repellent, and it can deter bugs, specifically ants. Again, the reason that I like it. There is a marinade recipe in here. In essence of time, I'm going to speed along here. You can use the flowers, cut the flower heads and use that in stir fries. Will grow well anywhere. So I think I've got a few more here, y'all. I hate to keep y'all, but valerian, this is coming from the Latin valere, which means to be strong. So that's what it symbolizes. It was used as a tincture in World War II to treat shell shock, which today we know as PTSD, because the Anglo-Saxons, we actually have documentation of them using it to treat shock. We often think about catnip as being the fun herb for cats, but actually valerian is it has a little bit better effect. I'm not saying go out here and plant that for your cats, but you'll notice that it will actually make your cats a little bit drunk if they roll around in valerian. It does stink. It smells like dirty socks. Maybe that's the reason cats love it. I don't know. But this was also one that was used to treat epilepsy back in the day. And then Germany, when we think about valerian, Germany's the one that has over 100 proprietary drugs based on valerian. Think about diazepam or Valium. It's very similar in how it acts as a tranquilizer, but this plant yields much less side effects. But they're not the same. Diazepam and Valium don't come from this plant, but they're going to act very similar. And you can kind of see what that looks like. It was actually considered an old-timey favorite. It does grow wild here in North America, so you'll probably see that growing. It looks a lot like Queen Anne's lace, but there's what that root system looks like. Pretty intensive, and what it would look like in your landscape bed. And a lot of folks will call this spikenard. There's some differing opinions on that as well. And then vervain. This is considered an old companion to the human race. Egyptians love this plant. they said it came from the tears of Isis as she wept for her dead god Osiris. And there's a link in there with that story. But vervain was very sacred to the Romans as well. We see it in medieval medicine. Theodosius reported it to heal tumors of the throat, so it has a lot of potency. It said if you see a shooting star, rub vervain in a handkerchief over a pimple or a wart, it disappears. You just don't want to use your bare hands. That's why it's specified to use a handkerchief, because otherwise it'll spread. So Druids, when we go back to the Druids, they absolutely loved vervain. And you can see there from the Latin, it's a verbena, just as a FYI. A lot of folks consider this a plain Jane plant, but it was considered to be one of the most magical herbs in Europe and even still today, used to purify spaces, specifically sacred spaces, churches. It was used for spells and divination, immortality, crop fertility, prosperity, and even in love. So it was grown to protect, if you lived in an open space, it was grown to protect you from lightning and any type of evil forces. The Iroquois or the Iroquois Indian, they mash the leaves into blue concoction, and they have said that that makes obnoxious people go away. That's why I have a really huge stand of this growing in my yard. It's just all vervain, y'all. So I'll let y'all know how that works. And then vervain tea was said to protect people from vampires. Grows really, really fast from seed. Last one I'll talk about is woad. This was referred to as Glaston or asp of Jerusalem. The main reason this plant's grown, which is very similar to the wild mustard we see growing in springtime, it was grown for a dye over 2,000 years. So you may have heard of woad and weld. You can see, well, let me show you a picture of him. Woad actually yields a really pretty blue dye, whereas weld gives you yellow dye, and then madder gives you a red dye. So that just kind of introduces that. But you can see, kind of looks like deal a little bit, but this is the color that it yields. It's a really pretty blue dye. And with that, y'all, because I have kept you on here an hour and 15 minutes, I am going to wind us up. I think the only other plant I had was wormwood, maybe. So I'll make sure that you get that. The big thing about wormwood or artemisia is where absinthe come from. And we're going to talk about that next week. So that's why I don't mind dropping off a little bit early, because we'll dive deep into about 6, 7, 8 plants next week, and just kind of hopefully you'll learn something from where modern medication's coming from. It's been a lot of fun putting that together. So I'll pull the chat box and see if we've got any questions. If we do, I'll make sure y'all get a copy of those. And otherwise, look for an email tomorrow. And remember, next week is the toxic plants. It's probably not the best definition, but anyway, if you have questions in the meantime, don't hesitate to send me an email, and I will see you guys next Monday at 6:30. Thanks, y'all.
Good night, Melody. Thanks.
Good night.